Hello and welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, the Biden administration seemingly in lockstep with Israel following last weekend's attack by Hamas.
Also, the Speaker schmozzle and could a Kennedy upend the American election? But first...
President Joe Biden has pledged America's unwavering support for Israel following last weekend's incursion and massacres by Hamas militants crossing from Gaza.
You know, there are moments in this life, and I mean this literally, when the pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend.
Biden made it very clear whose side America is on and what should happen next.
Like every nation in the world, Israel has the right to respond, indeed has a duty to respond to these vicious attacks.
And this is about more than supporting an ally suddenly at war. The Hamas attacks on a music festival, villages, kibbutzes and other settlements also caused multiple American casualties.
So far, more than 2,100 people have been killed on both sides of this violence. 22 Americans are confirmed dead and at least 20 remain missing.
Israeli authorities say that up to 150 hostages were taken from Israel into Gaza by Hamas to be used as human shields. Hamas has vowed to execute one hostage each time a civilian building is targeted in Gaza without warning. The US State Department confirming there are Americans among those hostages. And the impact of that on the department's veteran spokesman John Kirby was clear.
There's been a lot of death and destruction in that region, but I've never seen anything like this.
I'm sorry. It's very, excuse me, very difficult to look at these images, Jake, and the human cost.
President Biden immediately sent an aircraft carrier strike group, including the USS Gerald forward to the eastern Mediterranean to try and deter any possible hostile powers from joining in the fray and potentially to play a role in any attempt to rescue hostages. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken also travelled to Israel earlier today for talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
To any adversary, state or non-state, thinking of taking advantage of the current crisis to attack Israel, don't. The United States has Israel's back.
Meanwhile, a lot of people wanted to know what former President Donald Trump made of all of that, and this clip was soon being posted and shared widely on Instagram.
Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them to see the evil doings of Israel and the United States.
Golly. And it turns out that is not some AI-generated deep fake. Donald Trump actually said that. But it was in 2019 at a campaign rally in Minnesota, and it turns out he was quoting Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from 7 years earlier when she was condemning an Israeli operation in Gaza.
Omar wrote that Israel has hypnotized the world.
So an old-fashioned clip out of context that was shared literally hundreds of thousands of times online, like so many other clips of violence and atrocities from past conflicts that are also being dredged up, all designed to have us confused about what to believe right now. This, for what it's worth, is what Trump actually said.
It was a big attack with a lot of dead people all over the place. Who would think that? And the only difference is, I believe, it's a difference between one president and another president.
Oh, so Trump thinks that if he was president, this war wouldn't have started in the first place. He also, though, aired some grievances against Bibi Netanyahu, which haven't gone down well with his Republican presidential rivals. Meanwhile, Democratic House member Rashida Tlaib is the only Palestinian American in Congress, and her statement didn't go down well either. She began, "I grieve the Palestinian and Israeli lives lost yesterday, today and every day." She then called for the end of US funding of Israel and what she called the apartheid system that creates the suffocating, dehumanising conditions that can lead to resistance. Well, fellow Democrat Alyssa Slotkin was not impressed with that, telling CNN, "It shouldn't be hard to condemn terrorists and terrorism." Fox News reporter Hilary Vaughan had some questions for Tlaib as well, which is fair enough, but the way she put it was not exactly a great moment in American journalism.
terrorists have cut off babies' heads and burned children alive. Do you support Israel's rights to defend themselves against this brutality?
And over the next minute and a bit, as she pursued the Congresswoman down the hall towards a lift, Vaughan asked about babies' heads being chopped off no fewer than 6 more times, concluding with this.
Do Israeli lives not matter to you?
Meanwhile, some conservative lawmakers believe that America needs to cut back on its support for one ally, Ukraine, in order to support another, Israel. Republican Senator Josh Hawley Xing, Israel is facing existential threat. Any funding for Ukraine should be redirected to Israel immediately. You remember Josh Hawley? Here he is, showing his support for rioters on January the 6th. And here he is running away from the same rioters once they broke into the Capitol building, chanting about killing the Vice President to stop Joe Biden being elected. Joggin' Josh isn't the only one drawing a connection between the situation in the Middle East and Ukraine. So has the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Коли відбувається такий удар терористів, усі, хто цінує життя, мають бути солідарними. Ми в Україні особливо сприймаємо те, що сталося.
And Zelensky has announced plans to travel to Israel in a further show of support. President Biden has announced a boost in US military aid to Israel, including ammunition and interceptors to replenish the Iron Dome missile defence system as well.
Yeah, I assume what was going on there with Zelensky. He was already pro-Israel long before this, but I imagine it wasn't lost on him that Russia delivered a particularly mealy-mouthed statement about the Hamas attacks on Israel, reflecting a certain kind of sympathy for Hamas. In fact, Hamas had previously sent delegations to Russia for a diplomatic powwow. And with Russia's increasing closeness to Iran as well, I imagine Zelensky would possibly see this as an opportunity to appeal again to those Republicans who might have recently turned against funding the Ukrainian war effort.
Yeah, and let's not forget, of course, the Wagner mercenary group was once involved in the training of Hamas militants as well. So these ties are long and deep. And then came this call from the President.
When Congress returns, we're going to ask them to take urgent action to fund the national security requirements of our critical partners. This is not about party or politics. It's about the security of our world, the security of the United States of America.
Note there, Chaz, that Biden said critical partners. He is certainly thinking beyond Israel. He wants that money for Ukraine as well. And the other connection being drawn is between the support that Iran gives to Hamas in many forms and that recent hostage swap deal, which involved Americans freeing up $6 billion worth of Iranian oil revenue that was being held in South Korea to be used for humanitarian purposes, ostensibly. Now, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance was pretty typical of the response. He took to social media, the site formerly known as Twitter, to say, Americans must face the stark truth. Our tax dollars funded this. I wish we weren't fighting against weapons bought with our money. What do you think of that?
Yeah, look, that's been the main attack on Biden for the last few days. So, shall we unpack it?
Sure.
Okay, firstly, did Iran have anything to do with Hamas's attack? According to the Wall Street Journal, Iran was involved. According to the Washington Post, Iran was involved. According to Hamas themselves, Iran was involved. But a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces wasn't prepared to say that Iran either planned the operation or trained Hamas for it. And according to US Defense spokesperson John Kirby,
we don't have any specific intelligence or evidence that points to direct participation by Iran in these particular sets of attacks over the last couple of days. That said, of course, Iran has long supported Hamas and other terrorist networks throughout the region with resources, capabilities, training. And so in that regard, clearly Iran's complicit here.
Okay, let's not split hairs then. Let's assume for the purposes of argument that Iran was involved. Could the $6 billion have actually funded the attack? According to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, it's impossible that Iran could have used that money to pay for the attack.
Not a single dollar from that account has actually been spent to date, and in any event, it's very carefully and closely regulated by the Treasury Department to make sure that it's only used for food, for medicine, for medical equipment.
Sure, but how do they know what Iran uses that money for? According to the State Department, the money is going to be spent directly from the account, and they will be watching that spending. So if they don't like what's happening with the money, they have the ability to freeze it again. And by the way, they proved that today by freezing that money again. But Nikki Haley isn't buying it.
Be honest with the American people and understand that Hamas knows and Iran knows they're moving money around as we speak because they know $6 billion is going to be released. That's the reality.
And look, it's true. Iran could use food money to pay for terror, knowing they've got this $6 billion coming for food later on, although they don't now. Except, if we're being real, like Haley wants us to be, then the $6 billion isn't actually the main issue. Because back in 2019, US sanctions had shredded Iran's oil exports, only for Biden to reverse some of those sanctions in 2021, which led to Iranian oil exports growing again. Their total oil revenue under Biden has been somewhere between $81 and $90 billion, a lot more than $6 billion. Had Trump's sanctions been maintained, Iran would have made between $54 and $61 billion. So that's approximately an extra $30 billion cash in hand sloshing around. But even that isn't being real, because really, terror doesn't require much money. That's the whole point of terror. That's how under-resourced sides in a conflict sometimes level the playing field. It doesn't cost much. In 2020, the State Department estimated that Iran gives around $100 million a year to Hamas and other Palestinian groups. So Iran doesn't need help financing terror. As one expert noted, Hamas funding is a relatively small amount in the context of Iran's overall finances. They'd most likely bankroll Hamas at the same level, regardless of what happened to the $6 billion. Quote, "The reality is that funding is a foreign policy priority for Iran," he said. "They're gonna find that money." Now, that's Iran. We should finally note that America has donated $890 million to Palestinians as well since April 2021, with more than $730 million going to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, a group that experts say lacks guardrails and has a high risk of Hamas benefiting. The Trump administration ended that funding in 2018, but Biden reversed that decision because it's meant to be a support system for Gaza. Critics have said stopping the funding just creates a humanitarian crisis. But the State Department said the agency had allowed Hamas to build tunnels under one of their schools and to stockpile weapons near their facilities. So the Biden administration has economically helped Gaza and therefore Hamas. But you know who else has helped them? Israel has. Israel of late has increased work and trade permits for Gazans because they believe that economic incentives made Hamas lose their appetite for violence. In fact, Israel's national security advisor had noted that Hamas seemed to have decided to curb its violence in an unprecedented manner. Quote, "Hamas is very restrained and understands the meaning of further defiance," the national security advisor said on October the 1st, a week before the attacks. And Israel allowed suitcases with millions of dollars in Qatari cash to enter Gaza since 2018. So, if you think Hamas's behaviour is improving, then it does make sense to offer them an off-ramp, because obviously Israel doesn't want to be duking it out forever with Hamas. Unfortunately, the gamble that Israel and America took didn't pay off, and it's a shame to politic that, I would have thought.
Yeah, indeed. The conflict in the Middle East and the capture of American hostages provides both political risks and even opportunities for President Joe Biden. Polls show that almost 4 times as many Americans blame the Palestinians for the violence than they do the Israelis. And in the first few days of this conflict, more Americans disapproved of President Biden's handling of it than did approve. The Iran hostage crisis dominated Jimmy Carter's presidency in late 1979 and 1980. His approval rating first soared into the 60s in a wave of patriotism, then crashed into the 20s when a rescue mission to recapture those hostages failed. It ultimately, of course, doomed Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign. Now, Joe Biden is old enough to remember all that. He was in the Senate back then. He knows this is a major political test for him, Chaz.
And we should note that there are 17 Americans who are missing. We don't know exactly how many may be hostages. The media is banding around the number 5 at the moment, but we don't know for a fact, but there are 17 missing.
Yeah, there is still so much we don't know about what has been happening over the last week. We did want to get a range of reactions for you. Shortly, we're going to hear from former Republican Foreign Policy Advisor Danielle Pletka and from Hussein Ibish from the Arab Gulf States Institution in Washington. But first this week, to one of America's most experienced Middle East diplomats, Gerald Feierstein, whose distinguished career culminated in being appointed ambassador to Yemen by President Barack Obama. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, John.
Why, in your view, did Hamas launch that attack last weekend, knowing they were effectively kicking a hornet's nest?
Hamas itself has not explained its thinking, but to speculate a little bit, I think that there were a number of different issues that all conspired to make Hamas think that this was a good opportunity. One, of course, is that the internal situation in Israel and this period of political dissent, contention within the Israeli political system has left an impression that the state of Israel itself, that the government had been seriously weakened. And we saw, of course, the positions of a number of Israeli military reservists who said that they wouldn't come out in support of the government because of their unhappiness with some of the political moves that the Netanyahu government was taking, and just this long period of upheaval and chaos within Israel itself. You have, of course, as the backdrop, 16 years plus of Israeli siege of Gaza, the immiseration of the people in Gaza, without any kind of a let-up or any horizon for things to get better. And that, of course, has created its own sense of anger and frustration within people there, and certainly has led to many, many more recruits for Hamas than you might have seen otherwise.
Ambassador, what role do you think America would best play over the next little period in Israel? Do you think they should be staying out of Israel's path, or do you think they should be steering Israel in a particular direction?
Well, clearly the Biden administration has made a decision that in the immediate term, what they need to do is to provide full support for the Israelis. I think many Americans were shocked by what happened in Israel last Saturday and Sunday. And so you have this immediate reaction. But I think that what the Biden administration can do and should do is really talk about what happens next and how do we move forward from this moment where, again, we're going to see a violent military response to the attacks. But that in itself is not going to resolve anything. There is no military solution to this situation. And of course, declarations that Hamas is going to be eliminated really stake out a position that frankly speaking, is unachievable.
Mr. Ambassador, do you see any potential prospect somewhere down the track of the West Bank and Gaza having a unified leader that allows them to progress forward in some kind of constructive manner?
We've seen from time to time, efforts to try to resolve differences between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, that have not accomplished anything. I think right now, the reality is that if the Palestinians are looking for a framework that can engage with Israel and can negotiate with Israel some kind of a way forward that serves the needs of the Palestinian people, Hamas is probably not going to be able to play that role. So, I suspect that what we're going to want to see is some way to strengthen the Palestinian Authority and hopefully expand their reach, perhaps even into Gaza, so that they can speak more authoritatively for the Palestinians. And again, look for openings for movement on the peace front.
Finally, Mr. Ambassador, what is your expectation from here in terms of the scale and duration of Israel's expected operation in Gaza itself on the ground, and also the prospect of a widening conflict either in the north with Hezbollah being involved, or even other state actors becoming involved in some level?
Well, and I think that one of the things to watch carefully is, and again, what we've seen in the initial reaction of the Biden administration is We support Israel's response 100%. We accept that Israel is going to have to take the steps that they believe are necessary in order to accomplish their mission of removing Hamas as a threat. But also, as the situation progresses, already what we're seeing is that the coverage, the narrative of what's going on is shifting increasingly away from what happened in Israel last weekend to the huge humanitarian catastrophe that is occurring right now in Gaza. And I think that as that story becomes more and more prominent, as that begins to become the dominant narrative of what's occurring, the pressure on the Israelis, the pressure on the international community to put pressure on the Israelis is going to increase. And I think that even though initially the Israelis were talking about military operations that would last for weeks or even months, I suspect that the reaction internationally, globally, to what's happening is going to lead to a much less ambitious response, and that we're probably going to try to get past this current military stage in the coming days, and again try to move to something that is a little more positive and a little more hopeful for the future.
Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, and good to talk to our friends in Australia.
And now for another perspective, we turn to Hussein Ibish. He's a senior resident scholar at Washington's Arab Gulf States Institute.
Okay, so their primary immediate goal is for the fighting to spread to the occupied West Bank and especially to Jerusalem. They want chaos to spread, engulfing the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Muslim holy places in Jerusalem that reverberate strongly in the Arab world in a way that Hamas as an organization doesn't. It's not really popular. And the way that Gaza doesn't tug the heartstrings. And the people of Gaza do. But something like the Al-Aqsa Mosque is near and dear to all the Muslims from Nigeria to Indonesia and back and everywhere else. And so they want unrest there. Now, in addition, I think they would like Hezbollah to get involved, but Hezbollah really doesn't want to get involved because of the Lebanese domestic situation. They need a war with Israel like they need congestive heart failure at the moment. And I think Iran would prefer to hold Hezbollah back as a deterrent against an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. On the other hand, if things get hot and heavy, you could see Israel plunged into a multi-front war, which would please Hamas no end and could lead to an Israeli strike on Iran.
So given that, and given that Israel are moving into Gaza, what do you think is the best response that Israel could employ at this point in time?
The wisest thing would be to limit the response as much as possible. I agree that politically and even strategically, Israel needs to make a show of reestablishing deterrence. They need to exact revenge. The Israeli military from the founding of the state and even the Haganah Jewish militia before the founding of the state of Israel adhere to a doctrine of disproportionality. They don't like one-to-one ratios of say, dead Palestinian civilians and dead Jewish civilians. They want 10-to-1. So they do definitely also want to keep that doctrine up and exact a very heavy price, not just to the Hamas leadership and fighters, but to the people of Gaza as well. They clearly want to punish them. They're referring to them as human animals. They're talking about delivering hell to them, and so all that's going to happen. But I think if Israel were to be wise, they would swallow a very bitter pill, which is that the status quo ante, the situation as it was before the huge terrorist killing spree that we just saw, is probably the best, it's almost certainly the best outcome at the end, with Hamas degraded, with its people killed, with its infrastructure and equipment destroyed, but with Hamas still there crawling out of the rubble, declaring victory, and kind of trying to pick up the pieces in Gaza. The alternatives are a long-term Israeli reoccupation, which will just be an abattoir for Israeli conscripts, and they'll be captured, and it'll be a nightmare. The other alternative is chaos.
And Hussein Ibish, what do you make of the response there in the United States, where public opinion and the rhetoric of the Biden administration is very much on Israel's side?
Well, it's inevitable, right? There's already a special relationship between the United States and Israel. There are some people on the far right, and increasingly more even on the far left, but not much in Congress, a few people here and there. But basically, other than the right-wing libertarians and neo-isolationists and the left-wingers, there are not too many of those, nobody really challenges in Congress the special relationship, the strong commitment to Israel. And it's true the public has a strong identification with Israel, and they know nothing about the Palestinians. They're horrified by this killing spree, which was, plastered all over American TV. Israeli spokespersons and their friends in Washington are very skillful at spinning things for the American public. So they go on TV now. In 2 minutes, you're going to get 3 mentioning of beheadings and 5 mentioning of ISIS and jihad and things like that. So it's going to be very heavy on the emotive rhetoric that tries to remind Americans about 9/11, about ISIS, about the Islamic extremism, of which this was a part. I mean, you don't have to make anything up. It is an iteration of that. However, I think one of the things that's going on here is that ultimately it's wiser for Joe Biden and for the United States to start to gently restrain Israel. So we're going to have to move in that direction. And Biden is still being vocally pro-Israel in a very emotive way, the way he does. He's very good at that, feeling your pain stuff. But Anthony Blinken and others are starting to pass the message that, you need to minimize civilian casualties. You need to let civilians gather. If you can't give them safe passage somewhere else, because there isn't anywhere else, at least create safe zones in UN areas and things like that. And basically, it's the beginning of a campaign to get them to make it short and sweet and get out.
If you're a Palestinian in Gaza right now, one of the Palestinians who'd like to see some kind of reform, what course of action would you recommend they actually employ when they're probably scared of Hamas?
Yeah, they are scared of Hamas. They're scared of Israel. They're scared, and they have a right to be scared. What could they do? Well, the only thing they really can do is, try to get an education or get their children an education and somehow get them out of Gaza. That's one thing. The next thing they can do is join the business community, because while there's no civil society allowed in the West Bank, in Gaza anymore, there's still one kind of moribund in the West Bank, but in Gaza it's not allowed. There is a business community that's allowed, and they have to, work cautiously around and with Hamas, but they're separate from Hamas. This is an emergency situation. I think for the Palestinians of Gaza, it's like the people in the plane. You have to put your own mask on before you help the person next to you. And I wish I could tell you how they proceed politically, but I think I would frankly advise taking care of your family and looking down the road for a little bit. Right now, I just don't think you've got much to work with in Gaza at the moment beyond taking care of your loved ones, if you possibly can. It's a very grim situation.
I spoke earlier to prominent conservative foreign policy commentator Danielle Pletka.
This was an incredibly sophisticated attack. It was planned with enormous operational security. Remember, the Iranians love to talk. The plan for something like this has been sitting, and I'm not joking, I read an article about this last week, on the supreme leader of Iran's website, right? Door to door, city to city, civilian fighting. So they've been planning it, but the Israelis didn't know it. In fact, not only that, Hamas has been very carefully putting out the message for months now that they're very focused on governance at home, transferring the war really to the West Bank. That's what they want. And the Israelis believed it. I also think this was a monstrous and incredible intelligence fail on the part of the Israelis.
Does Israel risk falling into a trap here from the scenes of absolute horror from the Hamas attack a week ago? We're now seeing scenes of horror from the Israeli retaliation in Gaza. Does Israel risk going from being victim to perpetrator of violence?
I guess it depends on your moral clarity. If your view is that decapitating babies and burning children to death and killing 1,000 people in their homes is so last week, and that Israeli retaliation is so now, then probably, for me, your moral compass is a little upside down. I don't think the Israelis risk that in my moral view, I think that the Israelis have a mission ahead of them, and that is to annihilate, to end the existence of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another important Iranian proxy in Gaza, for good, so that they may never return. I think that they've done everything that they can, and they will do everything that they can, as they indeed have historically, to spare civilian lives. So, for example, Israel has always called in to civilian sites. Hamas loves to hide their operations, their rocket fire, their artillery, their armaments inside hospitals, mosques, schools, apartment buildings. And the Israelis have always been quite scrupulous about trying to call in. Today, they hacked into Hamas's television network and said where they were coming. So they're doing their best, but there are going to be civilian deaths. This is a siege. This is war. And you know what? They say war is hell for a reason.
And I believe right now Israel is planning to take out Hamas's military wing, but leave their political wing. Is that enough? And if you did take out Hamas's political wing, what replaces it?
I don't know that Israel is passing like that. I know they've taken out several military leaders. I think they're planning on taking out all their military leaders. Hamas's civilian leadership, you know, we're going to hear a lot about how there were debates. There were deep and profound debates inside Hamas. Should we go and murder those children? Should we go and rape those women? Should we go and take over? And some people thought, well, you know, maybe this isn't good for our cause. They lost. And Hamas's political leadership is as culpable as their military leadership. Honestly, I don't know whether the Israelis are passing. If I were there, they all have to go. But you're right. Israel doesn't want to rule Gaza. Unfortunately, no one actually wants to help the Palestinian people in Gaza, let alone Hamas. I hope this period of time in which the rot, the horror, the inhumanity and the savagery of Gaza and of Hamas are cleaned out will be an opportunity for really good Palestinian people who actually care about the future of the Palestinians, who care about, you know, education, the economy, not simply killing Jews, right? That they have an opportunity in this interregnum to actually take over. But that's partly our responsibility. Australia, Europe, the United States, we give so much money. We ought to stand for good governance, for good leadership. We never should have tolerated these people to start with.
Chaos and confusion continues in Congress following last week's vote to dump House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The first time that had ever happened, not just to Kevin but to anyone. The motion to vacate, which triggered McCarthy's historic ousting, was brought on by disaffected Republican Matt Gaetz, who said McCarthy had proven that he simply could not be trusted.
The one thing that the White House, House Democrats, and many of us on the conservative side of the Republican caucus would argue is that the thing we have in common, Kevin McCarthy said something to all of us at one point or another that he didn't really mean and never intended to live up to.
And when it came to a final vote, 8 Republicans, including Gaetz, joined with Democrats to oust the Speaker, who then turned around and blamed the former Speaker, Democrat Nancy Pelosi, for giving him bad advice.
I told her I was having issues with getting enough votes. And she said, what's the problem? I said, they want this one person can rule you out. And she said, just give it to him. I'll always back you up.
Yeah, it's all her fault. You know? Yeah, he's got real leadership skills, I feel, Kevin McCarthy.
He should have a sign on his desk, the buck passes here. Congressman Patrick McHenry, Republican of North Carolina, yes, with a bow tie, was nominated as the designated survivor in the event of a terrorist attack. And in light of this political attack, he was therefore made Speaker pro tempore. And his gavel spoke louder than either words or his bow tie when he sent the House packing shortly after McCarthy was dumped.
Chair declares the House in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Oh, he meant that. McHenry did use his newfound power for one thing, though. He told Nancy Pelosi to get out of the office provided for her as the former Speaker because, well, now they have a new former Speaker.
Yeah, so with 5 and a bit weeks left till another potential government shutdown, and no House Speaker, What the House did then, of course, was to go on a holiday. But to be fair, McCarthy ally Garrett Graves said there was a good reason for that.
I think if we had stayed together in the meeting last night, I think that you would have seen fists thrown, and I'm not being dramatic when I say that. There is a lot of raw emotions right now.
I think I speak for everyone when I say they should have held that meeting he talks about, and they should have live streamed it.
Yeah, well, so much go on holiday as go to your rooms. The jockeying then began, of course, to find a replacement for Kevin McCarthy. There was even a suggestion at one point that former President Donald Trump, I kid you not, could become the next Speaker.
A lot of people have been calling me about Speaker. All I can say is we'll do whatever's best for the country and for the Republican Party.
And it is true, there is nothing in the Constitution that says the Speaker has to be a member of the House or indeed a member of the human race. Although congressional rules do state that the Speaker does need to be able to call for votes requiring a certain language proficiency, so we're not likely to see a Labrador in the running. 2 Republicans did put themselves forward for nomination as Speaker this week. Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan, a favourite of both Donald Trump and a mentor to Matt Gaetz, and Majority Leader Steve Scalise, a political, if not personal, ally of McCarthy. A secret ballot was held yesterday.
And on Capitol Hill right now, we have breaking news. House Republicans have nominated Steve Scalise moments ago as their new Speaker.
But Scalise only won by a narrow majority over Jordan. He was super keen to take that Speaker's gavel quickly with a vote on the floor of the House, though.
First, I want to thank my House Republican colleagues for just designating me as the Speaker. Obviously, we still have work to do. We're going to have to go upstairs on the House floor and resolve this and then get the House opened again.
Not so fast, Steve-O. They stayed downstairs to count the numbers again, and no matter how they sliced and diced it, they couldn't get to the magic number of 217. So they went home again. Earlier today, the arm-twisting turned to hand-wringing. Steve Scalise then announced that he was dropping out of the race because he could not get the numbers he needs. Reports now suggest that Jim Jordan also lacks those 217 votes. There's talk of new candidates like Whip Tom Emmer emerging, or maybe even a return to Kevin McCarthy. That is how weird it is getting. This week, a wild card was dealt into the 2024 presidential election with this announcement from Robert Kennedy Jr.
I'm here to declare myself an independent candidate.
Although his enthusiastic sign wavers kind of messed up his big moment.
Independent candidate for President of the United States.
Well, that was positively smooth compared to how the whole event began.
I need my speech. You can't read anything. You can't read anything. What? Yeah. It's upside down. It's upside down.
This teleprompter seems to be quite independent as well.
It's like, ich bin ein... What's that next word? Oh, my goodness me. It was a bit amateurish, wasn't it? But speaking of independence, this campaign is all about independence.
I'm here to join you in making a new declaration of independence for our entire nation.
By which he means independence from what he sees as corporate control of government, big tech's control of free speech, and a grab bag of other stuff. Kennedy has been running as a Democratic presidential candidate for months, but he was frustrated by the Democratic Party machine falling in behind Joe Biden, failing to schedule any candidate debates. In some cases, they weren't even scheduling traditional primary elections. Kennedy's support has drifted in opinion polls from around 20% when he declared back in May, down to around 15%. Joe Biden's and Marianne Williamson's, who are the only other two declared Democratic candidates, have both drifted a few points in that time as well, to be fair. But as well as being the son of the late Senator Robert Kennedy, of course, who was assassinated running for president in 1968, and the nephew of President John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Jr. has had an interesting career to this point. Harvard graduate, a recovering heroin addict, an environmental lawyer who built his reputation taking on big polluters, sort of Erin Brockovich style, And in many minds, he's kind of destroyed that reputation by questioning the safety of vaccines and repeating false and discredited claims that they cause autism. They do not. The question now is, what impact will he have politically? Well, a recent poll of a three-cornered contest put Trump in front of Biden by 2 points, with RFK on 14%. And that's interesting, Chaz. He drew 2% away from Donald Trump and 4% away from Joe Biden, and the rest from non-voters, undecided, and so on. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very uneasy about polling right now with third-party candidates because traditionally they start off with a bang and then they kind of, when people start getting a bit serious towards the end. So, for example, Gary Johnson, a Libertarian in 2016, in July 2016, so we're talking only a few months before the election, he was polling with an average of 10%.
Yep.
But by election time, it was like 5%. The actual number was 3.3%. The other thing is that these third-party candidates, they don't tend to do so well in swing states because swing states are aware of the situation. And so they tend to get smaller results. Now, obviously, it doesn't take much if it's super close. Ralph Nader in Florida, for example, in 2000, doesn't take much at all to make a difference. But yeah, I feel like the polling situation, we're just not going to know the impact between Trump and Biden for some time. Like, for instance, he's been quite popular amongst the Republicans until recently, but Republicans, as soon as he announced, they came out hard with attacks.
Sean Hannity, the very next night, was suddenly, don't like this guy anymore.
Totally. Like, literally within an hour of him announcing, the Republicans put out 23 reasons to oppose RFK Junior. To basically accuse him of being a closet Democrat, not a real independent, etc. So, yeah, so they're going to work on him. And so it's very hard to know where this ends up somewhere down the track.
Which is why both sides are clearly a little bit anxious about where he could draw away support. But if we're going to talk historical comparisons, may I remind you, they don't all finish up like Gary Johnson getting 3 or 4%. Ross Perot in 1992, 19% of the vote. Now, debate still continues as to whether did he draw more from Bush or more from Clinton? Did he cost Bush re-election? Analysts tend to suggest that he probably drew fairly equally from both. John Anderson in 1980. At one point, John Anderson was coming second behind Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter looked like he was going to come third. In the end, you're right, as they got closer to polling day, the protest vote ebbs away, partisanship takes over, and we are certainly in more partisan times than we were in 1980.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing for Perot. He had a bigger vote as well, and it dwindled.
Didn't help that he dropped out of the race midway through and then got back in a month later.
Right. But the main thing is, what we have to mention when it comes to RFK is that he now has to get on ballots. And we just saw his launch. He doesn't strike me as a very organised fellow. It's hard to get on ballots. He needs to get on 50 ballots now. And my bet is he doesn't. Like Kanye West tried with Trump's people helping him, and he failed. Big time.
But to get on ballots, you typically need petitions of supporters. To get petitions, you need people with clipboards going door to door, getting people to sign their names, and money. And speaking of money, this guy raised $11 million.
Okay,
Kennedy
so he's got
did.
money.
He raised $11 million in the 24 hours after he made that pretty ordinary speech. And look, there's a lot we'll talk about in future episodes, probably in a big malarkey section, about the crazy stuff that RFK Junior says about vaccines, about COVID, about the CIA and his father and his uncle. There's a whole mishmash of stuff that is one of the big concerns here is not that he influences the election, but he influences people to not take vaccines, and as a result, people will die. That is one of the big concerns about this campaign.
I know we need to leave, but just I have to mention that it's not just him in this situation. Cornel West, who was going to run for the Greens, has announced this week he's not going to run for the Greens. He's going to run as an independent as well. So he has the same situation. Both those fellows have to get on ballots, which is going to be hard for both of them, which is why I don't think either of these people are the main event. The main event is No Labels, who have a machine that is getting them on ballots. They're already on 11 ballots.
So they're looking at an independent centrist candidate, and
they're looking at Joe Manchin. Oh, let's
could
just
be
name
Joe
it.
Manchin.
Yeah, that's what they're looking at. And
Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, also touted as a possible.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it looks like they're going to get on 50 ballots. So they are the actual threat to well, especially Biden, I think. So we'll see how that plays out. Kennedy and Cornel West, we'll see what happens to them. But I think no Labels are the ones they're really worried about.
This is going to be fun. And that is it for another week here on the Fireside Chat. Planet America returns to ABC TV on Wednesday, the 25th of October, so jot that down. We'll continue with the Fireside Chat every Friday night here on ABC News.
You can find us on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook. And don't miss this week's very peppy pep podcast in all the usual pod places right there.
Good night.